Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear friends, on behalf of the European Institute for Asian Studies, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this EIS webinar on the EU's Indo-Pacific Strategy, Stroking the Panda or Poking the Dragon, which we are jointly organizing with the University of East Anglia. The Indo-Pacific is back on the forefront of international relations, and the EU is definitely not staying behind. After having launched their own strategies for the Indo-Pacific, Germany, France, and the Netherlands pushed for an overarching EU approach towards the region, which was launched on the 19th of April. Many initiatives have been set up to support this EU strategy, such as the Franco-German Observatory of the Indo-Pacific. But the question remains how the EU can play a role in the Indo-Pacific, what impact its Indo-Pacific strategy can have, and how the EU can make a difference on the ground with its presence and cooperation with its partners in the Indo-Pacific. We look forward to a lively debate and would like to extend our gratitude to the speakers for sharing their views today. Questions to the panelists can be asked through the comments section on YouTube and will be addressed during the Q&A session after the presentations. I would like to now pass on the floor to our moderator, Dr. Ra Mason, who is a Sasakawa lecturer in international relations and Japanese foreign policy at the School of Politics, Philosophy, Language and Communication Studies at the University of East Anglia, while he is also the Japan Forum editor. Ra, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you very much to everyone at EIAS and at UEA for bringing this event together. It's a really exciting event to kind of develop the relationship that we have between the two institutions and to draw in so many participants. I'd also like to extend a thanks to all those who have registered and who are with us today. And of course, especially thanks to our three fantastic speakers who I think really couldn't be better positioned to discuss the topic that Lynn has just outlined. So I'm going to introduce our three speakers in a moment. I'm just going to say one or two words about the EU strategy itself, very briefly, in terms of my immediate reaction to the documentation, to the wording of that. And then I'll introduce the three speakers, and then the speakers will speak for around 10 minutes each, during which time everybody else who is participating is very, very welcome to add their comments and questions in the chat. And then should be plenty of time for Q&A after our speakers have finished. So just in terms of the strategy itself, this was fascinating to me. It's an area that I focus on mostly from a Japanese perspective. And so to have this EU perspective on the Indo-Pacific as a whole was very striking, particularly in terms of the response to China, which of course is in many respects the primary source of both concern, but also of future prospects across the region. So the strategy itself states that it will aim at contributing to stability, security, prosperity, and sustainable development. And that this is based upon the promotion of democracy, rule of law, human rights, and international law. So a very clear set of guidelines, but a much more subtle approach to actually naming or identifying particular issues within each of those spheres, and specifically in terms of naming or addressing China directly. So that was probably, I think, the most striking aspect of this, and I'll be fascinated to hear what our three panelists have to say on that. We might also suggest that, or we might point out that China is not absent entirely from the report, but the way in which it has been more subtly addressed is through this quite sophisticated language referring to such terms as geopolitical competition, tensions over supply chains, universality of human rights, compliance with international law, and reciprocity in trade and investment, and also connectivity. So all of these things are really speaking, if you like, to China without speaking to China, which creates a fascinating kind of milieu from which to develop, as Lynn pointed out, EU policy, which is at a very pivotal point and which needs to be taken forward both carefully, but also quite vigorously, I think. So I'm going to look forward to hearing my more learned and expert colleagues' opinions and thoughts on this. And I'd like to introduce each of them in turn briefly. We are very lucky to have with us today George Cunningham, who is EAS Strategic Advisor on Asia-Pacific issues at the European External Action Service. George has worked for something like 40 years across fields of politics, international affairs, and has worked in Africa, across the Asia-Pacific, I believe, Europe and in the United States. So a man with incredible experience and probably better placed perhaps than anyone on the planet to discuss this topic. So it's going to be very interesting to hear what George has to say. And he's also been very engaged with education in terms of inspiring the next generation of speakers. Speaking at universities and forums such as this, which allow people access to his expertise. George will be followed by an equally ideally placed speaker, I think it's fair to say, in Garima Mohan, who we welcome as a fellow of the Asia Programme on the German Marshall Fund for the United States. Garima heads work on India and leads the India Trilateral Forum. So is based in the GMF's offices in Berlin, but I believe actually is currently stationed, or at least currently physically in London. So thankfully, our three presenters may have been coming and going a bit, but they are all in the right time zone now. And Garima has also worked as leader for coordinating the EU's Asia-Pacific Research and Advice Network, APRAN. So that's supporting EU policymakers on issues which are directly concerned with the Asia-Pacific. So again, a fantastic speaker to have with us to gain insights and an analysis of this very pivotal issue. We then, last but certainly not least, have a senpai, a senior of mine, who, like me, graduated from the University of Sheffield, Philip Shetler-Jones, who is currently Honorary Research Fellow at University of Sheffield and also Associate Fellow in Indo-Pacific Geopolitics at the Council on Geostrategy. It's a new think tank. Philip works on EU and also works on an EU German funded project, which is enhancing security cooperation in and with Asia. So this is for GIZ, and I will leave the translation of GIZ to Philip, but I believe it translates to something like the Organization for International Collaboration. And Philip has a fantastic range of experience working across different institutions, the UN and elsewhere across Europe, and also in the military itself. So very much a man with experience of boots on the ground and the sort of the full spectrum of the high politics of institutions right through to the military aspects and the geostrategic aspects, which are physically there on these kind of flashpoint areas. So three fantastic speakers. All is left for me to do now is to hand over to the first of those speakers and hand the floor to George Cunningham.
And thank you very much, Raymond, and you are a fantastic moderator, if I may say so. We're all fantastic here. Happy to say that I survived a meeting this morning. One or two of you were present at the second EU-China experts meeting on maritime security, which was a good hotbed of discussion, but it means that we are in touch with all the partners in the region, and we are always looking for ways in which we can cooperate, and that is why we call this the EU Strategy for Cooperation in the Pacific. It is not to confront anyone, but it is to see how far we can go with how many partners in which directions. And I think, in a sense, we don't pick sides in that respect. We have our views as to how the world should be, of course, which may differ from some people, when we propagate those views. But in terms of, trying to be constructive, I think we're there with this strategy as well. So in the 10 minutes that I have, I'm just going to go zip through the strategy and just to give you the sort of background on the whole thing. The first thing is that, of course, the EU has been in the Indo-Pacific region for a long time. It is the #1 investor of all places in the Indo-Pacific. It is the top development assistance provider. and it is amongst the biggest traders in the region. So it's a huge stake that we have. And we define the region to be going from the east coast of Africa, so encompassing the whole of the Indian Ocean. Some of our colleagues start from Pakistan eastward, but we start from the east coast of Africa. And then we go all the way to the Pacific Island states. We then go as far as the United States and Canada. We stop basically with the French territories in the Eastern Pacific. So I'm not going to go through all the statistics, but of course, 60% of the world's population, it's 2/3 of global economic growth before COVID-19. You have China that is continues to grow throughout 2020, along with Taiwan, by the way, in the region. So the economy, the world economy hasn't spluttered into no movement in this respect. We still have it, and we are hoping very much, and we're wanting very much to have this prosperity restored to the Asia, to the Indo-Pacific, so that we are also benefiting as European Union from the investments and the trade that goes between us. We are, the region is important also for at the forefront of the digital economy. Very important for technological development and cooperation potentially there. 2/3 of global patent applications are produced in the Indo-Pacific region. And it's also very key for climate change and the environment. More than 50% of global CO2 emissions in the area, and 70% of mismanaged plastic waste by 2025, they say in the statistics. So it's a kind of, it's very important, but there are also very great challenges there as well. And the biggest challenge perhaps is the geopolitical competition that's intensifying there. That's producing significant strains on trade and supply chains, as well as in the technological, political and security areas. Military spending has increased almost by 50%, from 20% to 28% in the last 10 years as a percentage of the world total. There's a big weakness because there is no regional security order to mitigate the challenges of the security problems that exist there. Also, there are vulnerabilities because of 40% of global trade going through the Straits of Malacca and 30% through the South China Sea. So there are potential choke points if things go wrong. Also, rare earth access. It's a source of we have to work on nuclear non-proliferation there. Imagine if something was to go wrong there. Of course, that would send the markets flying. Malicious cyber activities as well. But, and importantly for the European Union as well, is the fact that the universality of human rights is being challenged in the region. We're seeing, of course, that's happening in the world. Happily, United States somehow seems to be on a better course, but in the region there is a deterioration going on, and we wish we could do more actually to do something about it. But it is another focal point of our interests. So the increasing threatening of the stability and security of the region and beyond is therefore directly impacting on the EU's security interests as well. So a number of partners have already adopted Indo-Pacific strategies. It should be recalled that Japan was first in 2007, way before the United States, and therefore the definition Indo-Pacific actually comes from Japan originally. And then since 2013 onwards, Australia, India, United States, ASEAN with its outlook, New Zealand and the UK have all produced Indo-Pacific approaches of their own. And Canada is expected to have one as well soon. So it was a unanimous decision of the EU member states to ask the EU to propose a strategy. It was, of course, led by the 3 countries that have Indo-Pacific approaches amongst the member states, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. And the opportunity of the US administration coming in also made the EU produce a joint communication on the EU-US Agenda for Global Change of December 2020. And in that, there was an important sentence which already showed the intentions of the European Union, which reads increased, one of the bullets being increased EU focus on the challenges and opportunities in the Indo-Pacific region will help deepen cooperation with like-minded partners in the region. And it continued actually also to talk about promotion of democracy in the region. So therefore, the EU strategy has to start off with the basis of universal values and principles. And so the Council, in its conclusions, said that the aim was to contribute to the stability, security, prosperity, and sustainable development of the region based on the promotion of democracy, rule of law, human rights, and international law, with the aim of creating a sustainable, green, digital, free and open Indo-Pacific in full compliance with international law, in particular UNCLOS. So therefore you see there the transition of the priorities of the Commission, the green and digital side in particular, and the transformation of that, or the work that we'll have to do in transforming that into how the approach should be done in the region in these two particular areas. Now, the EU strategy is based on the principle of inclusivity. This follows, of course, the strategies of France, Germany, and the Netherlands. In that respect, we're not picking fights against anyone. So this renewed commitment to the region, because of course, one of the great advantages of the strategy is that people refocus into the region. So it's as a matter of fact that, you know, it's up to, it's part of it is the EU leadership saying, yes, this is an important region, we have to focus on it, because at the moment they have been focusing on neighborhood, they've been focusing on Africa. So it's a refocusing into the region and an awareness raising exercise as to the importance of the region. So that is being achieved quite well, actually. And the nature of the strategy in terms of exclusivity is to be pragmatic, flexible, and multifaceted, so we can build our cooperation according to specific policy areas where partners can find common ground based on shared principles, values, or mutual interest. And there I would, this is a sort of standard phraseology within the Council conclusions, but the sort of operative interesting word is or. It's not shared principles, values, and mutual interest, but or mutual interest. So that gives you the flexibility, really, as long as common ground can be found to work with any partner. And so, of course, we're going to choose different policy areas for different partners and the intensity of them with the different partners. So, but having said that inclusivity, we also say we're going to deepen the engagement, in particular with those partners that have already announced Indo-Pacific approaches of their own. Because in a sense, you know, people have been saying for some time, you know, well, what's the EU's position on the Indo-Pacific, this term Indo-Pacific? And this term had started to come into use little by little since September 2019 in EU parlance, when there was a partnership agreement connectivity with Japan. That's the first time that the Indo-Pacific as a term was used. The Japanese really wanted it there, so we kind of agreed at the end of the day. And so then slowly that term has been adopted, and hey presto, then comes the strategy, which says, well, what do we mean by the Indo-Pacific? What's your interpretation of the Indo-Pacific? So to be able to work with partners in different streams, we have to have a broad range of policies to work with them. And indeed, as you know, the EU is involved in so many different areas. So we want to try to bring those areas into the region itself and see what can be done that somehow adapts them, of course, to the realities of different cultures and people and different economic situations. And that's also an interesting experience for our Commission services in particular, to really focus on those, you know, those adjustments that should be made. Okay, so we're dealing with the Green Deal, we're dealing with digitalization, we're dealing with strengthening regional organizations. Of course, the EU loves ASEAN and working with ASEAN, but there are, of course, many regional organizations like the Indian Ocean Rim Association, like the Pacific Islands Forum and so on. And in some of those, we are observer status, some of them we are invited to come. And we want to sort of systematize and be much more stronger in those regional organizations as European Union, being a non-threatening kind of organization or body. You know, we are pretty much welcome in all those areas. So we belong to a lot of regional organizations, and we want to really also up the game in them. The other areas, for instance, health systems, the EU has not been involved in that very much. It's not been one of the top areas, but of course, COVID-19 has brought to life the fact that resilience in health systems is very important. So we'll be looking into what contribution we can be made there. On human rights, where there is a deterioration going on, of course, we do our best with the tools that we have at our disposal. We have a new tool, as you know, in terms of the sanctions regime, but it is actually an uphill struggle. And the more that people can come together and really help the human rights situation, I think it's better. We've been very much involved in disaster risk reduction since 1996, so intervening in various earthquakes and such areas. So that's going to be more of a focus, particularly on satellite warning systems. On technology cooperation, we'll be seeking a widening of horizon, of course, to involve a number of partner countries in the region. It's the first time that's going to be happening with the New Horizon Europe program. Sustainability and prosperity, FTAs. We've just had the big EU-China summit, which means that we are launched potentially on an FTA with India. This is a huge advance forward, and we're still negotiating with a number of other countries, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, and we have mandates to negotiate with more countries in the region, ready to create almost a network of FTAs with many of the ASEAN partners in particular. We're always looking towards advancing the connectivity agenda, and again, the EU-India summit managed to do that, agreeing a number of projects that we should be doing together. And what's very important with the like-minded in particular is to intensify cooperation in multilateral fora, where of course there has been a lot of activity in terms of the values agenda in particular, not just the values agenda, but also technology, also standard setting and norms, in which we want to ensure that there is a level playing field, in particular, say, in the United Nations, for instance, where changes have been taking place in that respect. Now, one thing I haven't talked about, which I'm going to talk about a bit more, is security and defense. So here the strategy has made some advances in terms of EU thinking, and we're pushing more into the Indo-Pacific. The phrase that has been picked up by the media is the phrase, a meaningful European naval presence in the Indo-Pacific is acknowledged as important for the future. This kind of, although it is a kind of very general statement, it actually then creates a policy eventually that goes behind it. So this is the first attempt actually at trying to beef up the naval presence that's taking place. At the moment, we do have a German frigate down there. We have a Netherlands frigate joining the UK task force that is going into the Indo-Pacific on a tour. These are small things at the moment. We would like to do better than that, and this kind of signals the fact that member states have to discuss it, because of course it's a entirely member state competence area, and we do not have any kind of military force of our own as the European Union. So anyway, we're going to get involved in protecting critical maritime routes through capacity building of partners to improve their maritime domain awareness, organizing more joint exercises and port calls between Indo-Pacific naval units as well as European member states, navies operations, keep going with the counter-piracy, which is, as was said this morning in Beijing in the discussions we were having, is an area where there has been good, successful cooperation between the European Union and China. Nice mutual kind of mutual benefit kind of work that can be done between naval forces. Increase the participation in the EU's military and civilian common and security defense missions. Cooperation with certain partners on counterterrorism, cybersecurity, maritime security, and crisis management. And expanding our dialogues on security and defense, into particular the ASEAN Regional Forum. So that's what we've produced, and actually in terms of new policy, this is quite an advance to actually start getting member states involved in the region much more concretely. Excellent. So with China, we're going to do our best. We're just finishing up, don't worry. On China, we're going to do our best to work as long as the common ground can be found. And just to say, of course, climate change, biodiversity, and other topics are on the palette. And to finalize, to say that the Council conclusions on the strategy were adopted on the 19th of April, just recently. Now we're going out talking about it to our member states, the European Parliament, talking to our partners in the region. And then we're writing a joint communication, which should be out in September 21, detailing much more what we're going to do with the strategy in the region. So there's more to come and more presentations to be made. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, George. So fantastic range of topics, and also really fascinating insights into how those are actually being implemented. And I should just remind participants that that strategy is available. It's not a hidden strategy or one that you can't access in the meantime. Obviously, the details of it, George and colleagues are working on. But in the meantime, up until that September release, you are able to look at this online. So I would urge participants to do so. Okay, I'm sure there's already some questions and comments coming in for George, but we will address those at the end. Next, I would like to hand over to Garima Mohan and let her have the floor. Garima.
Thank you. Thanks, Ra, and thank you to Lynn and EIAS for the invitation for this event today. I'm honored to be here and speak on this panel. Since George has covered pretty much what is in the strategy, I would like to focus on some assessments of the strategy from the region, what have been the reactions of partners, and what are the different ways of reading this document. And Ra, I think in your introduction, you laid out the China question quite well. It is indeed for observers of the European Union a surprise to see such a comprehensive document come out on the Indo-Pacific, because as early as 2018, we heard a lot of there was a lot of hesitance in a number of European member states as well as Brussels in even using the term Indo-Pacific. So it is, we've come quite a long way in two and a half years or so. It is great to see the EU recognize the importance of this region, to underline that the challenges in the Indo-Pacific and dynamics in the Indo-Pacific will have an impact on European security and prosperity. But it is also important to see that the EU is trying to position itself as a player in the region that has a stake in the stability of the Indo-Pacific, and that it does not want to be a partner just sitting on the sidelines and watching the developments unfold, that it indeed has a role to play in the region, and that comes out quite closely in the strategy. When we try to assess how does the strategy position itself vis-a-vis US-China competition, on the importance of countries like India, on the importance of security engagement, diplomacy, I would say if you can imagine a continuum with the French strategy on one hand and the German on the other, the EU approach sort of falls in the middle. I do feel that the German policy guidelines are very broad, in a way try to not take any positions, while the EU document does. I think it presents a very balanced and realistic approach because it asks the question, what are the areas where the EU can bring an added value? The Indo-Pacific is a crowded theater. We don't want more partners coming in indiscriminately and creating duplication of efforts. So it's interesting that the EU positions this and frames this as a strategy where the EU can bring an added value. So it's not just a change of nomenclature from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific. It is indeed a way of thinking about the region strategically. And the areas where the EU as a whole brings added value is, number one, the question on trade, investment, and supply chains. Second, on global health. Then third, high-quality infrastructure, security and defense, including maritime security, but also cyber, disruptive tech. It was interesting to see that mentioned in the document. And overall, the idea that the EU is already doing a lot in the Indo-Pacific. This is the time to give strategic direction to various European efforts and projects to make sure they match what the EU's like-minded partners need, identifying gaps in the region where the EU can bring in added value and sort of plug in those gaps, and maybe creating better burden sharing in the Indo-Pacific. So it's heartening to see, and I do have a positive assessment of the Council conclusions. One thing in terms of practical steps, if you see the document, it outlines mostly what the EU is already doing in the region. There are a few new instruments mentioned, for example, expanding the Crimario project perhaps to the South Pacific, or the enhanced maritime presence instrument. But overall, it basically shows what the EU is already doing in the region, which is a lot. I think another way of interpreting this strategy is to see what the EU will do with it. And the initial signs coming out are quite promising. I would like to bring up here the Europe-India leaders meeting, which happened on May 8th. George mentioned briefly in his remarks, but I think the recognition of India as an important pillar of stability in a multipolar Indo-Pacific is a central aspect of Indo-Pacific strategies of countries across the world, of Japan, of Australia, the United States, even ASEAN. And so the recognition of the India partnership and fundamentally shifting the Europe-India partnership is a crucial first step as to how Europe will engage with the region. This Leaders Summit was quite an important meeting in that sense. It included the Indian Prime Minister and all 27 heads of state. This is a format rarely used by the European Union, has only been used for the US in the past, was offered to China last year, didn't end up taking place in quite the same format. And the conversation, what came out of this summit, is even more interesting. And I would encourage everyone to look at the joint statement, which reflects the EU's Indo-Pacific priorities quite well as they come into force with partners, like-minded partners like India. In addition to the resumption of the free trade agreement, it does talk about a dialogue on supply chains, institutionalizing security and defense cooperation, particularly a dialogue on maritime security, a whole connectivity partnership with a list of projects, which are potential projects that were listed. Quite interesting to see that, because one of the criticisms of the EU-Japan connectivity partnership was that it's good to say that we agree on these principles on paper, but when it comes to implementation, it's difficult. Dialogues on climate change, as well as EU-India cooperation on global health and recovering from COVID-19, because of course it came in the aftermath along with the devastating COVID-19 second wave in India. So when we look at the practical steps of how this strategy is being translated, it is also very encouraging. The idea of enhanced maritime presence, if the EU is able to implement it, would also be a game changer. As far as I understand, it is on voluntary basis with member states coordinating their naval and air assets. A few examples mentioned by George also show that European member states are beginning to think in those terms, which I'm sure partners in the region have noted. I think going forward, there are a few questions that are still up in the air, and a few sort of challenges the EU will have to overcome. And I think the biggest question, the biggest debate in the Indo-Pacific now is the ability of countries that are interested in the Indo-Pacific or working with partners in the Indo-Pacific to be able to deliver alternatives, to offer public goods, to offer real alternatives to Chinese investments, or other partners which are sort of not like-minded and are dominant in the region. And here, I think on two issues. First, on connectivity, it's all great that the EU has a connectivity strategy, but it remains to be seen where the funding will come from, how these projects will be implemented, because right now the only game in town, so to say, is the Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of other countries are doing their own projects. Japan, for example, Japan and India are trying to work together in India's neighborhood. Australia has sort of a connectivity investment instrument as well, but there is a need to coordinate these and deliver. Second, I think because we are in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, we cannot forget that vaccine distribution, equitable distribution of vaccines will be an important question as well. And for the EU to play an important role in the Indo-Pacific, this could be an area as well. Let's not forget, at the very first Quad leaders meeting, they created a vaccine working group because the need of the hour is to provide public goods. And that is the way of that the sort of competition will also unfold in the region, perhaps in a way that is more productive. I think secondly is what Ra also mentioned in the beginning, a sharper policy on China. Whether it is the French approach or the German or the Dutch or the EU, as well as if you even look at the countries in the region, none of their Indo-Pacific strategies are predicated on the idea of confrontation or containment of China. All countries, the whole idea behind the Indo-Pacific has been first to, of course, respond to the rise of China, but also the uncertainty of US engagement. So we have to first understand that this is something, the room for cooperation with China is open for all partners. But at the same time, aggressive moves by China in the region is forcing its partners to take sharper positions, be it the border conflict with China, confrontations and conflict with Japan, economic retaliation against Australia, increasingly aggressive posture in Europe as well. So there is a need for sharp China strategy that is different, independent from the Indo-Pacific approach. But at the same time, the EU will not be able to go through this region, increase its investments in the region, increase its partnerships, and avoid taking positions. If you're working with your like-minded partners or you're looking out for your interests, there will be a need to take sharper positions at a certain point, which is a related point to working with the United States. I do not really see how in this document as it exists, a reflection of change in US policy under the Biden administration, which is perhaps based on a more positive agenda of competition, but by providing alternatives. If the Quad Summit is something to go by, it's a fairly new administration. But the initial signals have been more positive. And I think in the next document that comes in September would be interesting to see if the EU outlines what role it sees for the United States. It does mention in the Council conclusions that it'll work with countries that have their own Indo-Pacific strategies, which includes the US, but would be, given the centrality of the transatlantic partnership, would be interesting to see how the US figures, which also applies to the UK. The UK in its integrated review mentions coordination with France and Germany, but I think for the EU, it would be interesting to work with the UK as well, which has a long history of both diplomatic and security engagement in the region. And then finally, I think from an analytical perspective, and a very interesting aspect of the Indo-Pacific has been the emergence of issue-based coalitions. And George repeatedly stressed cooperation based on issue areas, partnerships based on issue-based cooperation. And these coalitions, be it the Quad, be it the Blue Dot Network with Australia, Japan, United States, there is the India, Australia, Japan network on supply chain resilience. France, India, Australia trilateral focusing on the Indian Ocean. Now, if Europe wants to plug into these conversations around supply chains, around the Indian Ocean security, around emerging technologies, and indeed public goods provision in the Indo-Pacific, it'll have to figure out how to navigate these coalitions. The EU is more comfortable with traditional institutions, where you have a secretariat and you have a staff working, but perhaps less so, and it'll have to be more nimble because these coalitions and a networked architecture of security that is emerging in the Indo-Pacific is quite an interesting development, and it must inform our policy choices going forward. And I'll stop at this stage. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Garima. Again, fascinating insights, particularly to have a kind of understanding of a more India-focused perspective, and also really refreshing to hear an expert speak so candidly about the great powers and about, of course, the key issue of funding, which is always central to many of these policy developments. Okay, I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to go straight over to Philip and let Philip take it away.
Thank you, Ra. Congratulations. I think, as George explained, you've caught this strategy at just the right moment. It's still evolving, and so it's a great moment to have this conversation about where the strategies come from and feed in some way. It's the discussion about how it's built on now as we move from the conclusions to the joint communication in September, and then obviously I guess we can expect continued change. I don't think we'll be allowed to rest that long once the strategy is out either. I think it seems such a dynamic region and such a crowded region. So let me jump into a few observations, skipping the points that my co-panelists have very ably made. I'm going to just draw a couple of observations that I think, when you step back from it and you step back from some of the comparisons with other strategies and papers, what sort of stands out about this one, and some of the things that it has and what that might imply, and some of the things that it doesn't have, and maybe deliberate omissions or telling omissions of things that we might then discuss could lead to either opportunities or challenges in implementing the strategy. So the first one is, this is, as was said, an Indo-Pacific strategy. The Indo-Pacific concept is not an entirely neutral concept geopolitically, as we mentioned. It came from Japan, Australia, was picked up by the US, latterly India and ASEAN, and comes to the EU. It's not a concept that every country in the region likes altogether. There are some views in the region that Asian or Asian Pacific security issues are matters for resident powers, and outsiders coming in or drawing circles around areas of the region, including India, are somehow overstepping the mark. So even by taking up this concept, I think you already begin to feel that the potential for tension there between the desire to be inclusive, the desire not to take sides, the desire not to contribute to a world being divided into two blocks, becomes apparent quite quickly. But it seems to be catching on everywhere. So perhaps it's just the longer term trend. Everybody will accept Indo-Pacific sooner or later, maybe. Then for me, I'm glad Garima and the German Marshall Fund noticed something else which stood out to me, which was that the United States is somewhat missing from the picture. I was thinking about this when George commented to the effect there isn't a regional security structure, and in a way, of course, that's true. You don't have NATO, you don't have an integrated political structure like the EU that has security and defense features, but you do have one big long-term resident security structure in the form of the United States alliance system, formerly a hub and spoke and now becoming a more network system. Also, older structures like the five-power defense arrangements centered on Malaysia, Singapore, with Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And then, of course, there is a latecomer Quad, India, Japan, the US, and Australia. So it's becoming, it's still true to say there's no single security structure in the region, but to follow that is becoming, I think, more relevant. So I think that's one of the things that it will be interesting to see as the policy evolves, whether there will be more recognition. I think that the German policy does mention the US and mentions NATO. The French equivalent does not, as far as I know. And in some ways, perhaps that reflects the way that this strategy so far inclines to a more French vision of the region in the security and geostrategic level, and maybe a more German or wider European vision of the region in some other areas, trade, environment, and connectivity. This is a strategy, as was said, for cooperation. Then again, I think that raises this question of cooperation with who, because there is something attractive about cooperating with everybody, but I think it depends how the region goes, whether the direction of security relations in the region allow one to cooperate in a balanced way with all, or whether there are already pressures to align more with some than others. This is a bit the heart of the tension of having a strategy which is, if not values-led, at least balances values and interests. When many of the like-minded countries that one might more easily work with on the main issues are getting together in things like the Quad, that creates pressures, I think, in that direction. But the other point of view on this, I suppose, I'd be interested to, and I think this is also coming up in some of the questions, will this policy exhibit the ability of the European Union to appear and present itself as an alternative, a kind of third or alternative partner for countries that don't wish to align, don't wish to join a D10 or a Quad or any other such grouping? And I think that will be one of the tests of it in the way that countries in the region respond to it. As was also mentioned, it's a quite broad strategy, I think, when you compare it certainly with the UK tilt and a bit with the French policy. It has, I think, about 2 pages out of 10 that deal with traditional security issues, and a lot of the rest of it is on other issues. But there are some quite interesting new directions, I think, tucked in there. George mentioned the disinformation one, for example, and I think that this is something where there is a common experience and a common security concern with disinformation as it relates to democratic political processes, as it relates to even issues like health and misinformation and dealing with COVID and vaccines and so on. There's also interesting opportunities in using some of the EU's endowments in maritime domain awareness, space, satellites, information sharing, and I think in the German policy there was already a reference to a facility in Singapore which is looking at the disinformation, and I think some of these information sharing mechanisms may become quite an operational focus of this strategy, and that will be one I'll be watching. The space, I think, is an interesting one. I was taken by what George said when he mentioned the geographic limit on the east end, going up to the South Pacific and the territories of France, and not reaching the US. And again, this is perhaps another way in which one can see a difference between this strategy and one or two others. But this is, in a way, talking about, I suppose, EU territory in one understanding of it. And it's not a strategy that says the EU is a resident country in Asia. I don't think. I'll be happy to be corrected on that. But I think that there is something essential there in the fact that we're a country like France, which is a resident Asian country and sees itself that way, when that policy is combined with the European Union policy, then that does create quite a strong core interest and quite powerful in shaping the rest of the strategy. I think that the strategy will be tested by some tough challenges in the region. UNCLOS is mentioned, which is a way of talking about disputes over claims and territories in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and in other places without mentioning countries. But some other points, as was mentioned, Myanmar, but also Taiwan, DPRK isn't, I think, mentioned explicitly, but a nuclear non-proliferation is. One of the questions I think that was in the feed was about how this strategy lines up with the Belt and Road Initiative. And again, I think that this is part of the feature, that coming into this region at a moment when there are competing, contending frameworks, both in terms of the security like the Quad and the FPDA and so on, the D10 in a democratic level, moving from a sort of G7 to a D10 potentially, but also in trade with the RCEP, the CPTPP. These are economic and trade and investment mechanisms which are really in the very familiar territory of the European Union as it's normally understood. And so it's entering quite a competitive area. And that may be in some way a new experience compared to former strategies that have looked towards regions like Central and Eastern Europe or Africa. This is, in a way, a much more developed region in terms of some of these trade and investment structures. And so it's happening not only at a more competitive moment in terms of geopolitics, but at a moment when the EU model and the EU experience is just one of several options, as it were, for countries to look at. And I think that's both a challenge to the strategy, but also an explanation about the why now. Because if you sit in Europe and you watch these institutions rising and gaining members and gaining powers and strength, then I think it comes part with this concern about being frozen out in some way of new set of blocks being constructed. And so it's entirely understandable that you want to be present. And I think presence and the idea of increasing presence is mentioned in the strategy. And that will be another practical indicator to watch, I would say, in terms of how this is put into practice. Do you have more representation in the EU delegations? What kind of skills and experiences do you have there in your staff? What kind of relationships do they build with not only individual countries, but some of these institutions in terms of the governance, the economics, but also the security and defense? Now, I'm going to round up in just a minute there. Ra, do you think I should call a halt here, because I want to allow good time for questions if we have any?
I think you've got another couple of minutes, Philip. If you've got a couple of points you'd like to round up on, that's fine.
Thank you. So I think one last observation or idea about this is to think about where it complements some of the other alternatives. As I say, it doesn't engage directly with the fact of the US security alliance system, and in some ways maybe there's a complementarity there as well. that some of the things the European Union can bring are fitting into different areas where there is demand and interest in an alternative partner. It will be interesting as well to see, there's been some trailing of EU-American transatlantic cooperation and strategizing about policy towards China and the region, and to see whether, as that goes along and as the Biden administration does more work on that transatlantic vision sharing, does that come out in new elements of the strategy that we see change between now and September? Will there be some sort of formal nod towards that dynamic? And if so, will that be a purely transatlantic one, or will it involve countries like India, which is clearly geographically the big feature in the Indo-Pacific that makes it different from the Asia-Pacific, is what we in the EU used to refer to this region as. But at the same time, I would say, about to Garima's observations here, is that the identification of India and the kind of partnership the EU wants in this strategy with India is also less defined, I think, than it would need to be. So I'm going to leave it at that and look forward to getting into some questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Philip. Again, really interesting, particularly to hear the inclusion of the US perspective and also some of those very sort of practical geostrategic considerations. I've actually got bountiful amounts of burning questions that I would like to ask myself, but I am not going to. I'm going to allow others to come in, and we have some very interesting questions emerging from the chat. So I'll pick up some of those, and panelists would be very welcome to come forward and address those. The first one is actually one that Philip has already touched upon towards the end there, so we might perhaps hand this on. This was also a question posed from Bill Hayton, who asks, to what extent does the EU think of its Indo-Pacific strategy as a third way, an alternative to both China and the United States? And Philip already kind of touched upon this, so I wonder if perhaps we should hand over to George and Garima and get their thoughts first, and then perhaps we can go back to Philip if he wants to add to that. So George, perhaps.
Okay, I don't think that we're sort of positioning ourselves in any particular way. It sounds good third way in the sense, yes, we're not in either of the camps, but obviously we're also more with the like-minded, more with the ones that share values and principles, and it has to be said that the US administration under Biden specifically is like that. And so, of course, we're interested in, and that's why we have EU-US dialogue, indeed on China for that matter, because we want to also see how we should be dealing with the Panda. So values and principles are important, and just to also, I can take make a number of other points on Myanmar, because I noticed in the chat we have Myanmar as well. Well, there we are actually trying to work with ASEAN to try and get some kind of movement on the situation in Myanmar. Of course, one can pile in with all the like-minded, but you make statements and then what happens? Nothing, unless they have some teeth, and even if they have their teeth, they're a bit toothless on occasions. So the more you can do work within the system, and the system there is ASEAN and ASEAN pressure, peer pressure, and so on, the better. And so that's where we're going with that, rather than necessarily with the like-minded. Of course, we discussed the issue with the like-minded nonetheless. On connectivity, I don't know if it reminds me just taking a few of those points that have been made on connectivity. Yes, it is an issue concerning delivery, but with all this Indo-Pacific, it should be said that we coincide. We're talking about how timely it is. Well, it is timely in another way, because we are working within the European Union on a 7-year, this coming 7-year cycle of our development assistance funding. And we're programming all that funding, and that's going on now. So the Indo-Pacific strategy is being inserted into that funding cycle to see, and therefore to make it qualify for all kinds of areas that we might want to develop, depending on our discussions with partners and the way we see the prioritization of things going on. So perfect timing that as well, by chance, in fact, of course, because what's the chance that you're in that the right place on a 7-year cycle is pretty remote, but there it is, we are. Yes, what else was there? Yes, and to say, of course, as was said, that France is in the Pacific, specifically 1.5 million citizens live there. So, of course, France is very focused on throughout this whole development of the Indo-Pacific strategic strategy that we've been doing. France has been at the forefront of pushing for things and pushing for ambition. So I just want to also recognize the great work they're doing. Final point on Quad, the softer side of Quad, the Quad is developing now a working group on vaccines, technology, I believe climate change as well. And we're interested in that kind of cooperation with the Quad because these are areas where one can have a major impact. So just a sort of scatter shot across different things that people have said, and I hope that's been helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Yeah, absolutely. I wonder as well if we could maybe get Garima's thoughts, particularly in terms of the development of India-EU relations that you mentioned, Garima, and the idea that we need an alternative to initiatives like the Belt and Road. That would certainly perhaps answer this question on the third way further.
Sure. I'll just start with first the third way question, alternatives to China and the US. The recent EIAS survey on attitudes in South Asia, of course, highlighted the EU as a very trusted partner ahead of both countries like US, China, but also India and Japan. So there is some merit to this argument of thinking of this as the third way. But overall, the development of the Indo-Pacific idea itself is, in a way, a search for countries for alternatives and for a third way, as it were. I do have to caution that we have to be careful when we talk of coalitions like the Quad, because they're not alliances. It is not a formal alliance. Countries like India do not do alliances. And when it comes to this sort of search for a third way and inclusive sort of interacting with, leaving options open for both dealing with China and the United States, it is actually India that was among the first countries to use the term inclusive when it outlined its Indo-Pacific strategy approach at the Shangri-La dialogue. And it was one of the first countries to say it will take an inclusive route. So I think we have to be a bit careful in characterizing these coalitions. They're not treaty alliances. And it is indeed a search for a third way of dealing with an assertive China, but also managing an uncertain United States. Clearly, under the Trump administration, it was unpredictable. But even under the Biden administration, a lot of people had questions as to whether it will be more inward-looking or not. And given that a lot of countries in the region depend on the United States for security, that the whole Indo-Pacific idea in itself is a search for a third way. If it's a sort of a more abstract answer to the question. And on the question of India and the EU partnership, Philip mentioned that it is not, sketched out as much as it could have in the Council conclusions. While that is correct, the joint statement and the recent Leaders Summit really lays all doubts to rest whether, this partnership has changed and the importance of India for the European Union. It's really clearly outlined in several aspects, both when it comes to cooperation for regional security at the global multilateral level, and increasing both diplomacy, economic, political cooperation across the board. When it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative and providing alternatives to BRI, for India, it's a crucial question because it is through BRI that China's influence is increasing in India's neighborhood. The whole concept of the string of pearls through investments in deep water ports in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, increasing political and economic influence of China, along with investments in Indian Ocean states, in Nepal, in Maldives, Seychelles. All of these questions are very central for Indian foreign policy, and therefore the focus for India has been its neighborhood, and it's looking for partners to deliver alternatives to Chinese investments, because India can't do it alone. And so the India-Japan partnership has been exemplary in this regard. The fact that India is open to dealing with countries like the United States in the Indian Ocean region, where it was initially very reluctant to have outside partners join in, is a result of this as well. And here is where the EU-India connectivity partnership fits. And it is in the sense of providing alternatives. I saw the question was on Pakistan, and it has to be underlined that the EU has actually been investing in South Asia for a long time, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in India as well, through pipelines, investments in civil aviation, technology, trainings, etc., while they were never branded as alternatives to Belt and Road. And I'm glad the EU now has a connectivity strategy to brand these projects as such. The EU has been one of the largest donors through development aid and otherwise of projects that are infrastructure related and lead to connectivity in the region.
Thank you very much indeed. I wonder if Philip might want to respond to some of those points, and perhaps, Philip, you might also want to bring in the United States, which was touched upon there, but you'd be kind of answering your own question, but do go ahead.
Yeah, the question about whether this presents the European Union as an alternative, I would say no, not exactly. I think the spirit of it is something that actually a lot of countries of Asia are more used to, which is not an alternative in the sense that if you choose this, you can't have membership in the other ones. It's more an additional network or strategy to dock into, in addition to any other partnerships or alliances or arrangements that you may wish to be a member of. So I think if it manages to do that, then that will make it a lot easier for some of these issues, which are quite contentious, to be overcome, because the EU will be an additional rather than an alternative partner. On the US question, I do wonder how much of the momentum behind some of these strategies and moves to the region were premised on assumptions about American relative decline, and in the years before President Biden came in under Donald Trump, I think a lot of people felt a very strong sense of American withdrawal and unreliability and wavering, and so that's understandable. However, I wonder if that was a more transient sensation than it felt like at the time, and we will see now, as the Biden administration gets its feet under the table and starts to express its own strategies and respond to events, whether that assumption is still valid, and whether or not that affects some of the momentum, but also the direction of different approaches to the Indo-Pacific. They will, to some extent, I suppose, fit in around what the Americans are doing, if they continue to do as much as they have in the last 70 years. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting to hear the thoughts of Garima and Philip there on the role of the Biden administration, because this is such an open question, and clearly it's creating a certain degree of uncertainty. There's a couple of questions around that which we could perhaps extend or pose, but there's lots of other questions in the chat, so I think we're going to have to jump across to one or two other subjects. There's a question here which asks, to give some moral substance to the EU's IP strategy, aside from the stress on geo-economic and geopolitical concerns. This is asking about the Myanmar question again. So we've got the question here is, the coup d'etat in Myanmar saw a democratically elected government overthrown before it could even return to office. While resolution of the situation is ultimately in the hands of the Burmese people, yet within the context of a European Indo-Pacific strategy, the Myanmar situation opens up a unique occasion. So it says, the question asks then goes on to say, A, to give some moral substance to the EU's IP strategy aside from the stress on geo-economic and geopolitical concerns. B, to coalesce with key like-minded IP players, the Quad, in demonstrating a shared commitment to promoting democratic values. C, both leverage and give some meaning to the EU's SPA with ASEAN. So George already answered part of this question, I think, to a significant extent. I wonder if either of our other panelists would like to come in and address this. Garima, go ahead.
I can say a little bit. The question of values is and democratic values is interesting in Southeast Asia, in the Indo-Pacific region context. I think perhaps the EU has already coordinated behind the scenes with countries like India, but it also begs the question, since the question asker mentioned key like-minded IP players like the Quad, it begs the question, what have the Quad countries done on Myanmar? I mean, the US has issued statements, but India has done very little. It can do more in terms, at least in sheltering civilians. What has been the role of Australia and Japan? I think the Myanmar question is a test case, which also shows the limits of this cooperation, particularly of the democratic values agenda, which, if that is the basis of our Indo-Pacific strategies, would run into trouble very, very quickly in the context in Asia.
Thank you. Philip, would you like to add any thoughts to that?
I do think that is one of the tensions about this. The risk of putting too much emphasis on values as a common denominator between partners, since it's such a diverse region. And even if you look among the ASEAN member states, you have Myanmar, you have countries under non-democratic rule. The trend there is not one sort of steadily progressing towards ever sort of more refined levels of democratic rights respecting representation. So I agree with Garima. I think that there's a limit to how far you can use a values rule in measuring the potential and the need for cooperation. And I think in a way that's a bit recognized already in the way that the European Union has talked about its positioning of China as a systemic rival, but a partner in other areas. And I think that the same sort of formula will be appearing in some of the more operational individual actions that come out of the strategy. But I yield to George on that.
Thank you. Yeah, in fact, we have an extra question for George, so I might allow George a little bit of scope to answer both of those at the same time. So we have a question asking, hi George, what are the options for the EU for expected chaos in Afghanistan after the US war on terror? So perhaps you could add that in, George.
Okay. Yes, so I mentioned in my response on Myanmar and the fact that we think the route to try to sort these things out is through ASEAN, because they can put peer pressure. Actually, they're also having difficulty in doing so, but there's close coordination going on that. And of course, yes, we are talking about other partners, but really it's ASEAN that probably has to primarily run with it. On the issues of values and principles, you're right to say it's extremely difficult, but unfortunately, I think we're about the only player in town that cares enough to push with these issues. I say that, of course, the US does, but the US doesn't when it comes to the previous administration. And so at the end of the day, that's why I guess we score quite well in the polls in terms of popularity, is because we are consistent and we are actually genuinely want to see the best deal for the people of the region, and that's by having them have human rights respected and so on. So it's a difficult path because, of course, the trend is in the opposite direction, and we really must keep working at new ways perhaps that we can deal with it. And I would even wish that you would have a seminar maybe devoted perhaps to the issue of what to do about this sort of the rise of authoritarianism and our relationship with the countries in the region under those circumstances. For instance, human rights is also not a great issue in India. It has a great democracy, but the human rights is not going terribly well at the moment. So yeah, there's a lot to discuss about that and a lot of concern. because for how long can you keep cooperating with authoritarian regimes, where you can, of course, when they're not threatening Europe itself, but when there is a threat to Europe, in case of one or two big partners, then indeed it's of serious concern, and we have to do something about it. The search is always what to do about it. The other question was on, oh yes, Afghanistan. Oh, I invite you to my seminar. I shall be doing a seminar in Afghanistan in my private capacity on the 7th of June, so I can send you details about that. You'll have prominent Afghan politicians speaking, including Dr. Abdullah. And we'll be learning from that what the situation currently is in terms of what the Afghan people are saying through their representatives, because a number of members of parliament will be there as well from Afghanistan. It's an extremely problematic situation, extremely challenging. The hasty pullout by the United States is causing advances by the Taliban. In a sense, we've got to be very careful that we don't play the game of deceiving ourselves about what's going on by saying somehow the gains of 20 years of in human rights and women's rights somehow are going to remain under the pressures that are going on at the moment. And then you say, okay, well, Afghanistan is not our country, why should we care? And then you realize, of course, that we've had all these this big immigration problem that has destabilized Europe, because you have people rightly seeking asylum or illegally seeking asylum, unfortunately. And what will happen if the Taliban gets into power concerning that, in terms of more migrant flows of people who are genuinely fleeing the oppression of the Taliban? What's going to happen concerning drugs, the spread of drugs, which already is the highest drug-producing country in the world, illicit drugs? And what's going to happen with the issue of terrorism in the world, emanating from a base which may be quite secure, because the links between Taliban and Al-Qaeda have not been broken. Anyway, to say it's a dire situation, sometimes, okay, so people say, well, we've been there 20 years, you know, and it hasn't really resolved itself. Well, sometimes in politics, the status quo, even it's not perfect, but the status quo in which you're trying to nurture society to improve itself, well, maybe that status quo is the political solution, regretfully, for many, many years, to avoid, you know, the potential, the arrival of the Taliban, if they manage to gain it through military means, which is what they're trying to do, irrespective of the so-called intra-Afghan peace talks taking place. Anyway, this is all my personal view, let it be noted. But it is a very worrying experience, which of course maybe is not reaching the minds of people living in Europe as being a big issue, but may well turn into an extremely big issue. And also for the United States when it comes to Al-Qaeda's not exactly unfriendly links with the Taliban. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Yeah, I think certainly it would be a very interesting area to have a seminar on. Thank you for the suggestion, and certainly Afghanistan as well is obviously an area that we do need to focus more upon. There's also a question come up in the chat for Garima, which asks, hi Mohan, I am Waka Ahmed from Pakistan. As you pointed out about the EU's alternatives to Chinese investment in Indo-Pacific, what are the EU's alternatives for Pakistan?
I think I briefly answered this question when I was talking of the EU's investments in the broader South Asian region, which predate the current connectivity partnership. As I mentioned, that the EU is already doing many, many projects in the region in terms of pipeline projects in infrastructure, civil aviation, through development aid and other instruments. And the connectivity partnership is just a new sort of way of presenting these under a strategic outlook. But European Union is one of the largest investors in infrastructure and related projects in South Asia. I would love to hear more from our Pakistani audience on the experience of CPEC, because they've been the beneficiaries of Belt and Road. So that would be interesting. But the EU is definitely a player in the region on connectivity.
Thank you, Garima. Yeah, hopefully I think that's a pretty comprehensive answer. So I think, Waka, you can be pleased with that. And if you have a response, then by all means add it, although I'm not sure we'll have time to go further along with that. Probably got time just for one or two more questions. We have one from Ripley-Jones, who asks, how can the EU show more presence and accept China, ignoring the South China Sea decision of the courts? China has a very pragmatic approach to cooperation, but that stops at questions of territoriality. So I think we can throw this open really to anyone on the floor. Perhaps Philip might want to address this first.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that is one of those elephant in the room questions. I think that there is an understandable tendency. If you say we have a strategy, people think of these issues of military strategic importance, and in this region, the South China Sea is certainly up there among the top 2 or 3. As George mentioned, there is quite a regular appearance of military from EU member states. France is a regular visitor in strength. There's an amphibious group there now, I think. The Netherlands will send a ship with the UK carrier strike group, and the German frigate will go. But I think this does, for me, it goes back to this question about how the EU member states either go further in this coordinated maritime presence that George talked about, which has been tested to some level in the Gulf of Guinea and in the Indian Ocean on the piracy. And one of the trailers, I think, in this communication was that the member states will look into the viability of extending that. But then it comes up against the practical fact that there aren't that many EU member states with navies with that reach. I suppose the Italian and 1 or 2 others could also join in such a mechanism if they felt that they could afford that in amongst their other defense commitments, depending on the situation in the Mediterranean and the Arctic and all these other quite demanding areas, which also have rising list of problems to address. So there is a potential for naval, but again, for me, I think the way that is unlocked is partnership with other frameworks of security in the region. So some kind of arrangement with the UK or with Japan, Australia, even if it's not, as Garima said, the Quad is not an alliance, but still some sort of coordination with some of the existing structures might go some way to making the EU presence have more effect than the sort of penny packet tendency, which is always the risk at this distance.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think there's also a question that relates directly to that in terms of how the EU combines efforts with the UK. So I don't know if you can say any more about that, Philip, or if that's really the extent that we can discuss strategy at this stage.
My impression at the moment is that the UK is working not with the EU as an institution on these questions, but with EU member states individually, principally France. There is definitely scope for more with Germany. And I think in time, there is a good chance of something with the EU. But I think it's just too soon after Brexit for actually both sides to feel comfortable sort of with the sense that what they're doing to express their agency and their autonomy in the Indo-Pacific, because in a way this is a canvas for both the EU and others like the UK to express their sovereign power. There's a risk of diluting that when you cooperate. You know, if you send a ship under an EU flag rather than a French flag, then you're getting a different kind of result. So that is a practical test, I think, of the willingness to compromise or sacrifice a bit on the desire to show strength and gain in return perhaps more effect.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think we will see those effects in the coming weeks and months, no doubt. we are very short of time. I wonder if any of our panelists have a final thought or comment that they would like to add. If anyone does, if you'd like to raise your hand. No, okay. Well, we are in the final minute. I know that Lynn would like to advertise EIAS's next event, and I'm sure join me in thanking hugely our three panelists for a fantastic discussion and the gaining of a huge amount of insight and knowledge, certainly for me, to the point where I have not had a chance to ask my own questions, but I've been certainly enlightened by the answers to those of the audience and the interaction of the panelists themselves. So I will hand back to Lynn and say thank you very much indeed.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much to all the speakers. Well, to George Cunningham, of course, Philip Shetler-Jones, Garima Mohan, and of course, Ra Mason for, well, an excellent moderation of today's event. As George has highlighted, we will be hearing a lot more about the Indo-Pacific strategies, and especially also like on the specific actions that will be linked to the strategy itself. But for that, we will have to wait until September. So we will be addressing the issue a lot more often in the future, and we look forward to hearing from the EU what they want to do about it. So what rests me is to thank you all for participating in today's event, and I would also like to cordially invite you to our next event, which is taking place next week, Thursday, on the 3rd of June from 10 till 12 Brussels time, on Sri Lanka and investment opportunities for the EU in Sri Lanka. So this is actually also linked to the EU's engagement in South Asia, and of course also might be related to the BRI and what the EU can offer in return. So thank you all very much, and looking forward to welcome you at our next events in June. Thank you.